Good Sunday afternoon, and if you'd like to join me now in a quick study, a continuation of Matthew's Gospel, we're going to pick up today in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. We had just finished last week chapter 13, where we saw many of Jesus' parables given there. We've been spending a lot of time recently in his parables. The last thing we saw was Jesus had gone to his home town of Nazareth, his home area, country, and the people there just didn't believe him. Instead of, hearing what he was saying and seeing his miracles and then believing in him, they instead were offended by him. And so we saw that sad encounter last week at the end of chapter 14. And now as we pick up today that was at the end of chapter 13, now we pick up in chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. And I look forward to continuing in this study with you, piece by piece, as we go through the Gospel of Matthew. When we pick up here, where now the camera changes and kind of comes off of Jesus for just a bit. And focuses on Herod the Tetrarch at that time. In this period, it says that at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus, all the things Jesus was doing, going around teaching, performing miracles, so on and so forth. Herod gets wind of that. He hears the commotion. He hears reports, rumors, of these great things that are happening, and he says to his servants, this is actually kind of funny, humorous. I think it's important to, if you will, find humor in a lot of things that happen in these stories. Herod, he says to his servants here, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." Well, oh no. Well, this is bad news for Herod and why he brings up John the Baptist. And we may, as we're reading through Matthew's account, I don't remember right off. I don't think Matthew actually mentions John the Baptist's death until this, up until this time. I think this is the first time he reveals to us, if my memory serves me correctly, the death of John the Baptist. And we don't really get word of that until now, or at least an explanation of, what happened to John the Baptist. Last we knew, John the Baptist was in prison. We know he had been arrested. He had been in prison. And now we find out some more details as to why that was. So apparently John the Baptist had been put to death. And now, Herod, though, for him, he thinks, and he's spooked, if you will, he thinks that John the Baptist has now risen from the dead. And why that's especially bad news for Herod is because, as we're about to read, Herod's the one who, put John to death. And Herod's also the one who was guilty of sin in which John tried to confront him about, which is what led to all of this. And so Herod thinks this, John the Baptist has risen from the dead. These powers are working in him. And here's the explanation. Read with me in verse 3. That Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and arrested him, put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, a lady by the name of Herodias, who was actually his brother Philip's wife. So somehow or another along the way, I guess Herodias and Herod decided to get together. Even though she was the wife of his brother Philip, which is just weird. But in verse 4, John, though, John said to Herod that it is not lawful for you to have her. And that would have been a brave thing for John the Baptist to do. To tell a man like Herod and Herod's position that, hey, Herod, you cannot take Herodias as your wife. You cannot have her because, it's not lawful. I mean, she belongs to someone else. She belongs to your brother. And apparently Herod did not like that too much. And although, verse 5, Herod actually wanted to kill John then, Herod wanted to put John to death because he was so angry at John for that. But he feared the multitudes too much. He feared the people because they counted John as a prophet. And so, Herod at least controlled himself for the sake of, political benefit. He didn't want to get the people upset and then them, revolt against him and so on and so forth. And so he let John live. Then, verse 6, when Herod's birthday came around, hey, birthday celebration, he was celebrating, and the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. I mean, they're pretty much, if memory serves me correct, from this account, possibly from other accounts, but anyways, they've probably been drinking, they're celebrating, and the daughter of Herodias, dances for him, pleases Herod. Therefore, he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Well, that's where things take a twist, because so she, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." And I mean, just wow, the sickening feeling of that. This show. I mean, obviously Herod, was a wicked man. He unlawfully, took Herodias as his wife, and then when John confronts him about it, he wants to kill John, but doesn't. Now Herodias has plotted to have John killed. She doesn't just want John killed. She literally wants his head brought to her on a platter. It goes to show the hardness of heart, the wickedness of these people. But the king was sorry, verse 9. We're told the king was sorry. I mean, I guess, maybe, however long had passed, he had let, John live. Either Herod had grown soft, so to speak, on John. Maybe he didn't, he lost his desire to kill John. Either that or he was sorry because, he still didn't want to get in trouble with the people. At any rate, we're told that he was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. I mean, he couldn't be found to, go back on his word. So he does it anyway. Verse 10, he sends and he has John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Again, what a very sick thing, to do. What wickedness, what wicked hearts, for them to, hate John so much. John, who had done nothing wrong, he simply told, the truth of God's word. But also to think of John. I mean, think of John the Baptist in his situation. He was a proclaimer of the truth. He prepared the way for the Messiah. He was a very humble servant, very devoted, faithful to the Lord. He's been arrested. He's been in prison this whole time, however long that had been. And now of all fates to suffer, John the Baptist is now executed. He is beheaded. Not a pleasant thing at all. Not a pleasant way to die. Very gruesome. But that was what happened. Which then sadly meant that he was no longer there on earth with his disciples, with Jesus. Even though John did, say that Jesus was going to have to increase and John was going to have to decrease. But it still would have been helpful, would have been nice for John to still be around. Nevertheless, that's just not how things happened. And so then the disciples of John came and took away his body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. And can you imagine what Jesus must have thought and been feeling, once he heard of John the Baptist's execution? I'm sure he was very upset. I'm sure he was very distraught over it. He loved John the Baptist, like all of his disciples, and especially like those who were closest to him. And if you remember, not only that, but John the Baptist was his cousin. So he had lost a family member, he had lost a good man, he had lost a faithful disciple, servant of God. And so really a very sad ending for someone like John the Baptist. Certainly not a way he deserved to die, but it just goes to show, the wickedness of man and the things they do. And unfortunately, the people of God suffer at their hands. But we know John the Baptist is okay. He had faith in God. He was faithful to God, and so he knew, that even though he suffered such a fate, it's okay because he is at rest, he is at peace. He has that eternal reward awaiting him in heaven. And so he finished his race. And he is to be commended for his faithful service to God. So again, a very sad fate for John the Baptist. Would have been hard for Jesus, but Jesus, still, had a lot to do, a lot of work to carry on in his own ministry. He knew that he was going to suffer a similar fate in being executed, but of course on the cross. And so here, that's why all the way back to the beginning of chapter 14, where this all started. That explains why then Herod was getting all worried, why Herod was anxious, why Herod was wondering, okay, who is this I am hearing of? Is it John the Baptist? He had asked, his servants at some point, who is this? And they said, well, some say John the Baptist, some say, a prophet, Jeremiah. But Herod said he thought that this must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. And you could have, I would imagine, at least the fear in Herod at first, because if that really was, John the Baptist risen from the dead, coming in power, then Herod would have known he's in trouble. Which, really, in reality, Herod's already in trouble. Even if John the Baptist, John the Baptist never came to him from the dead, but Jesus is there in power, although Jesus never does anything to Herod. But ultimately, Herod is going to answer, and is answering for what he had done. And so that's a bit of information we're told here, tells us what unfortunately happened to John the Baptist. And from there, next week, Lord willing, we'll see what happens after Jesus, heard, about, Herod looking for him or wondering if this was John the Baptist, heard about John's death, and we'll see what happens next week. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. I hope this was enlightening, helpful, encouraging, even as sad as it was, but as sad as it is. The good note, the happy note to take away, as we said earlier, is John had hope. He had faith. He's okay. As will all of God's faithful servants be, no matter what happens to them on this earth. God bless.